Okay, so now we're going to look at to what extent was the League of Nations a success. And first of all, we've got to look at how the League of Nations was successful in the 1920s. Then we'll look at what weaknesses made the League of Organisation basically fail, and essentially that it would fail. Then we've got to look at how successful it was later on in the 1930s. So the first key bit you've got to know about the League was its aims. And they had four key aims you'll probably need to know for a pet question in a paper. And these aims were to discourage aggression, to encourage cooperation in both business and trade around the world, to encourage disarmament and push for disarmament, and then improve living and working conditions for people around the world. And so they did this in many ways. So to discourage aggression, they seemed quite strong because they had lots of different ways to attack this. They had means of arbitration, tribunals, and also their influence over places. So they had the ability to pressure people into doing things that were for the better good and discourage aggression. For example, the islands dispute between Sweden and Finland gave, through the International Court of Justice, pushed and ruled in Finland's favour, and Sweden, because of the pressure they couldn't react, then accepted the ruling given, and other things such as Upper Silesia, Bulgaria. But on the other hand, in Vilna and Corfu and the Ruhr invasion, there was often other things involved due to the powers of the higher up people in the League. That's a different thing. But yeah, so they had the discourage aggression through the use of arbitration, so through use of pressures and things like that. Then they had the encourage cooperation in business and trade, and there was treaties such as the Locarno Treaty. But the issue with things such as the Locarno Treaty is they were done outside the League because they included countries like America. And so the Locarno Treaties, which encouraged business and trade, were outside America and weren't anything really to do with the League, so it can't be claimed as a League success. There was the Dawes Plan, which encouraged economic recovery. But again, that does not necessarily give the League much credit. That was in 1924 because you could see it as not being part of the League. And they could not impede the Great Depression or reduce its impacts because it didn't have the ability to, and so it was quite threatened from that. So thereafter there was competition, hostility in business trade, and actually increased and decreased due to things like the Depression. So there wasn't actually anything achieved by the League so much from that because all the main treaties had been done outside of the League and not in the League. And actually after the Depression there was still a big rise in it. Disarmament was one of the biggest issues they had done because only Germany was disarming, and that's because they were forced to. They tried to limit the tonnage of tanks, limit the size of artillery, prohibit certain ways of bombing civilians and chemical warfare. But most countries didn't want to follow it because they were very self-interested and self-indulged. They only wanted to protect themselves. Britain and France were divided on the issue. There was no unified approach from the two biggest powers in the League. And there was planes capable of bombing civilians, and manufacture of chemical weapons were never actually banned, just the use of them were banned. Anything that was successful in terms of disarmament or agreements was basically done without the League again. So there's the Washington Disarmament Conference in 1922, which kind of limited navy sizes, and there was attempts to disarm, but they were rejected by Britain in 1993. And again, the Depression came in because it increased the push for militarism because of countries basically wanting to focus their people on something else other than the huge declining economics that they saw, and this happened later in the 1930s with things like Manchuria and Abyssinia. And so actually, again, disarmament didn't have much of an effect. It was either dealt with outside of the League. There was lots of questions of people not backing it up. And again, the Great Depression caused it just to spike back up. Now, one area where the League is seen as being quite successful, moreover, and this is things that have actually carried on being into existence today in the modern day world, is to the improving of living and working conditions. So there was the organisations that were built up in there, the sectorial organisations and things like that, that pushed for certain things. So, for example, there was the Health Organisation, which did all the World Health, and that now exists today further on as the World Health Organisation, which I'm sure most people are used to and have heard of quite a lot. But there was the League, was built up of all these different groups, and these groups all had different jobs. So we'll discuss the structure of the League in a minute, but they were the commissions that dealt with issues such as working condition things. So they helped the USSR deal with the plague in Siberia, They helped not cure but try and cope with cholera, dysentery, smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, leprosy. They freed over 200,000 slaves and other people, 400,000 people. The World Health Organization, as I said, was started, and other such organizations were started to deal with things. There was an introduced of 48-hour working weeks, which kind of helped the kids, and they also provided valuable information and data gathering on drug trafficking, prostitution, and slavery. And they were basically very successful because the commissions covered all sorts of things. Now, I'll quickly discuss the organisation of the League before then covering what the weaknesses were with the League's organisation and how it could have gone a lot better in an essential way. So, the League was built up of the Council, which is the top people, and they met 5 times a year, and they were basically the ones that made the main decisions. They made most of the important League decisions, and that was built up of 4 permanent members, which consist of France, Britain, Italy, and Japan, and then 4 non-permanent members, which were voted on by the Assembly every year, and they could be from whatever country. And they met 5 times a year to make the key decisions on behalf of the League, and all of them had veto powers. Then there was the Assembly, which discusses important issues and elects non-permanent members of the Council, and they only met once per year, and they were built up of all members of the League, and they discussed everything to do with the running of the League, such as the budget, where it should be spent, and things like that. Then behind this, you had the Secretariat, which is the day-to-day administration of the League, so they were the people that essentially ran it. They kept the records, they had the specialist recommendations and recommenders to give advice to the people in the council and other places that had specialties in health, disarmament, and economic matters. And then you had the kind of commissions and other things. There was the Permanent Court of International Justice, which still exists today, and they meet in The Hague in the Netherlands, and they make judgments on international disputes and advise the League. So that's what we saw with the Ireland dispute. And then you have the International Labour Organization, which worked to improve conditions, collect data on working conditions, and basically push for a better condition for workers around the world. And they said they did this through reducing working weeks, through setting up better conditions. And then you have the actual commissions, the League commissions, which included the Mandates Commission, the Refugee Commission, the Slavery Commission, the Health Commission. And these existed to do all sorts of different jobs and features, and they did all sorts of kind of things. And they are what is seen as the success of the League over the many failures that were viewed of the League. So I've just covered the basic structure of the League, and it's good if you've got time to make notes on the actual structure and maybe draw a little diagram that helps you understand the hierarchies of the League. And so now we'll look at how far did the weaknesses in the League's organisation make failure inevitable, because as you probably know, or you need to know, the League had no permanent army. You needed unanimous voting, which meant that a crisis action was very slow, and it meant that powerful countries could veto. And obviously, because they only meet the whole council once a year, of course, issues in the Assembly only met 4 to 5 times a year, which is still pretty poor. So the League had lots of issues. First of all, they needed unanimous voting, which I discussed, which means they weren't very fast in reacting to a crisis. That often meant they were then at a disadvantage in the way they reacted. The Secretariat was understaffed and a bit of a muddle, so lots of the organisation of the League and the communication between different parts of the League was quite inefficient and unfluid. The Permanent Court of Justice did not have means of influence. They could only give advice, so in many ways they were essentially a puppet show, because they couldn't actually impose anything without giving advice to the council, who could then be able to pose their economic, their militaristic, or their moral condemnations. The structure itself wasn't the best because it was quite confusing. It wasn't clear in how you could control it. It wasn't clear who spoke to who, and it meant that lots of things didn't go as quickly as they should have, and it meant that lots of people didn't have a clue what was happening in essential ways. Also, the fact that there was big countries missing. So a key one was, of course, the United States. Congress had banned them from going into it. And so it meant that any big international decision actually had to be made outside of the league, and also it meant that any of the economic sanctions that the big councils could pose would actually be undermined by the US continuing to trade, as the US was quite a big trade partner. Of course, also not having Germany and the USSR in there for quite some time, especially during the 1920s, was not very useful for them either, which basically meant that they didn't have a full international stage of the great powers of the world. Really, they had two of the greatest powers and a couple of the more minor powers. And then, of course, the most famous one that people really everyone knows about and you should remember is that they didn't have their own army. They didn't actually have an army, so they relied completely on Britain and France to provide the economic, the militaristic, any of that kind of funding and sanctions. But Britain and France, of course, had their own nationalistic views and interests, and so it often meant that they had very much a conflict with each other and also with the other countries, because they were the two powers that everyone had to care about. And so smaller countries were essentially ignored and pushed to the side, and this was quite a big issue for many people in the league, and it caused a lot of tension. So, as well as having its own actual weaknesses, there was other factors that had kind of pushed the league to failure, and why it would have been inevitable. Because the league had some successes, even with these disadvantages, and they had a kind of push for different things. But often the failure of the league is blamed on the Great Depression, because it meant that lots of people were more focused on themselves, and it increased the pursuit of self-interest due to the domestic crisis, which meant people were looking for cheaper trade, for no trade. There was the high employment, discontent of trade issues. There was a rise in extremism. People were pushing for nationalistic views to protect themselves and increase their domestic contributions. So the Great Depression increased the economic competition between markets. People were willing to fight for markets, and therefore this led to rearmament as countries saw the tension rise. France worried about Germany's development work and began at the Manchuria line, so they saw each other as very, very threatening, and everyone was kind of scared of what was going to happen with international peace. It was on a knife. Countries considered imperialistic and aggressive means to feed its people and keep up morale. As I mentioned earlier, Manchuria and Abyssinia were two great examples of two dictators trying to distract their people from what was actually happening with the domestic situation due to factors such as the economic crash, depression, and that kind of was their drive to gain support from their people, whilst they couldn't do much else. And it also led to appeasement being a viable option for dealing with aggressors, because people couldn't afford to go to war, so they had to try and track these people down. And this is clear in how Britain and France dealt with Hitler at a later date, because they were still recovering. And at the end of the day, the League was going to fail. It was inevitable, because even though they had some great successes with humanitarian work, they were undermined by the decision of weak, selfish, imperialistic leaders and countries, and the Great Depression encouraged this pursuit of self-interest, and it basically pushed them over the edge of the fact that most of them were willing to work cooperatively, at least to the public eye, in the nature of the whole world, but at the end of the day they were self-interested to get what they wanted. Britain wanted to increase its empire, keep its trade up. France wanted to pursue other options. They had their public voters. France had a large communist backing, so if they went to war with communism directly, it could cause many issues. And so there was a lot of tension even between the people in the League, and it was really just pushed over the edge by the Great Depression, in which their traits were showed a lot quicker. So the League was going to fail. It's no doubt that the League was essentially a failure, but there are aspects that were very successful. With smaller disputes, of course, it was successful, and I have a video on my channel about each of these disputes, and I'll take you through that later. There's a card and a link down below, and you can talk and you can see how it was successful in some areas, but not in others. So you've also got to look at how successful the League was in 1930. So it was very unsuccessful in discouraging aggression. That's just a statement, everyone knows it. Because there was two crises. There was the Manchuria in 1931, and there was the Abyssinia in 1935. So Manchuria is northeast China, and China's a good buffer against communism, but it was weak due to a civil war. It was already controlled by a kind of private army, and there's lots of different there's a lot of different tensions ongoing in the area. So in order to kind of move their population, resettle their growing population, and also bring in more export industry and gain resources, Japan decided to go militaristic with their aims, and they invaded a place called Manchuria in northeast China, as I just said. And then there was lots of tension. There's bombings and blames from China, and so once these bombings happened on the edge of Japan, that gave them an excuse to push into Manchuria as an excuse to take over to restore peace. And so Manchukuo was what it was renamed to. It was set up with a puppet government in February 1932, and Japan's claim was to be merely settling a local difficulty, and China was in a state of anarchy. So the invasion was to ensure self-defense for peace. So because of China's sheer terrible state of its political situation and economic situation, etc., Japan essentially said they were just going in there to settle the area, stop them from being threatened, not that they were actually taking it over for their own personal gain. So Britain set up sent Lord Lytton as a commission to review the situation, but this report took a year to do, and by this time Japan had already set up the Manchukuo government. It had already set up a solid, essentially, country area. They had made it their own, and so when the League of Nations essentially ordered them to leave, they just left the League in 1933, and that they pointed out that Britain conquest in China was just as cruel, and that they had done exactly the same thing. And the issue was Japan could just leave without any opposition because both Britain and France were financially and militarily unprepared. They couldn't actually take it. They just couldn't go in together. Neither of them wanted to go in. And then, of course, USA couldn't help because they weren't in the League, so they weren't giving any economic sanctions, and they weren't really doing anything. So the League failed because the aggressors, permanent members of the League of Nations Council, broke rules and then just left. The League of Nations was shown as an organisation that wasn't taken seriously because Japan just saw they could leave. They could do whatever they want because they had veto power, they were on the council, and they could just walk out if it didn't go their way. And so it really showed how the League of Nations was actually kind of not doing anything. And so Japan took over a lot of China at Nanking, and then this encouraged Hitler and Mussolini, as they learned aggression did pay for the League of Nations way. It meant that they could get away with whatever they wanted, and it's made the League seem so weak and ineffective with its powers that really it was just a big puppet show that they did not need to be scared of. And it was essentially a group that could push down smaller nations' aggression, encourage peace, but only with smaller nations. So against big powers, it had no power because the big powers weren't affected by their economic impacts, and they could walk away, and they weren't even bothered by the fact there could be militaristic impact because they knew Britain and France weren't ready. Then, as many could say, as using the example of Manchuria, Mussolini took Italy into Abyssinia in 1935 to 1936, and there was quite a lot of motives for it. They wanted revenge for 1896 when Italy was defeated in Abyssinia by tribesmen. Having a victory in Abyssinia was great propaganda for Mussolini. It showed Italy is on the rise back up. It showed Italy as a strong country. It meant there were more resources and market to resolve economic disarray, so they could really push for their domestic situation. And they learnt from other situations that had happened, as well as the Corfu incident, which I can have a video on all the incidents, kind of gave them kind of success and a lot of confidence in the fact that the League wouldn't do anything. So the Mussolini invaded the Wal Oasis, and the League could not impose any effective sanctions, such as oil or the Suez Canal, as they would actually hurt the British economy. So they couldn't impose any sanctions without hurting themselves, so it wasn't worth it, because if they put sanctions on oil or the Suez Canal, they would have their impacts, trade gone. And so the Laval Pact was signed by Britain and France to appease Mussolini in about 1935-1936, and they invited him in 1935 to join a formalised anti-German protest, the Streza Front. And Abyssinia wasn't mentioned at all. Britain and France viewed Abyssinia as kind of a tool and irrelevant because they needed Italy as an ally against Hitler, as he slowly rose through the powers and was seen as a threat to Britain and France and what he was doing. And actually, a key thing about Abyssinia, how it showed the weakness of the League, is Abyssinia wasn't just a far-off country that wasn't near most of the League powers. Abyssinia was right next to British colonies of Uganda, Kenya and Somalia, and also ex-British territories of Sudan, etc. And so it was essentially on the League's footsteps. They had military power, they could immediately push in, but they chose not to because it wasn't worth the issues and the sacrifices they make on the ally with Italy against Germany. And then, of course, they also failed quite a large amount on the Disarmament Conference in 1932 to 1934. The conference was disrupted by Hitler's demands for equality of status and permission to essentially rearm Germany back up to the level that everyone else was. And of course, France was absolutely outraged at this. How would they believe it? The people that they saw as the aggressor, the main threat, were being allowed to rearm, whereas Britain was more optimistic, because Britain, lots of the British opinions saw that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh. They saw that Germans should be allowed to rearm up to size, and of course Britain itself didn't want to decrease in size, so they had a very large self-interest in not disarming. So from 1933 onwards, there was open disarmament, but did it really happen? No, there wasn't much disarmament on a major level. There was little treaties signed, but disarmament failed because only Germany was expected to disarm, so it was very unfair. No one was really serious about it, including France, which blatantly ignored the covenants made. The Depression increased economic competition, so military provided loads of jobs and defence for colonies and markets. It led to extremism in imperialistic, nationalistic views. And it also led to the rise of people like Hitler, Mussolini, and communism in general, Nazis and fascism, all those kind of things. And also, due to Britain and France being heavily divided on the issue, it meant that no pure conflict between the great powers of the world could be solved. And so nearly every single disarmament and aggression curbing effort had failed. So that is the key things, what you need to know for the League of Nations success and the extent of it. Now, I have a video down below or in the card. They'll go through events of the 1920s and some of the 1930s that were significant events for the League of Nations and how they reacted to it. So thank you very much, and see you in the next video.